King Louis XIV of France moved his royal court to Versailles in 1682. Though it had originally been a hunting lodge, Louis expanded and remodeled Versailles so that it became a glittering palace, worthy of his status as the Sun King. French aristocrats were expected to live there as well. But for the people who were actually there, it was most memorable for something considerably less opulent: the stench. So, today we're going to take a look at what hygiene was like at the Court of Versailles. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other French or hygiene-related topics you would like to hear about. Okay, watch your step. Versailles hygiene is très mal. Contrary to how most people view it today, folks in the 17th century didn't see hot water baths as a pleasurable indulgence or a hygienic necessity. In fact, many of them believed that bathing in hot water was actually bad for one's health. According to historian Jules Harper, the common belief was that warm water weakened the body and widened the pores, thus allowing diseases to enter. People everywhere, not just in France, found it much safer and better for the health to have a quick wash than soaking in a tub. King Louis himself was no exception. In fact, historians believe the so-called Sun King had only 2 baths over the course of his entire life. Très nasty. Now, that's not to say he never attended to his personal hygiene. He is known to have occasionally wiped himself down with a towel, scrubbed his body with perfume and alcohol, and washed his hands every morning. But sitting next to him at a dinner wouldn't be too easy on the olfactory sense. Now, as we established, Louis XIV wasn't too into bathing or showering, so when he got sweaty, he, like your old college roommate, would simply change his shirt. Louis and his courtiers changed shirts multiple times per day, a move that signaled both their money and status. However, though perfumes allowed users to mask unpleasant smells, body odor was still a major problem. Sadly for all involved, underarm deodorants wouldn't be widely used until the 20th century. In modern times, answering nature's call is typically a pretty private experience, but that wasn't always the case at Versailles. Louis XIV, for example, often took meetings with visitors while on the commode, as did other members of his court. Kind of gives a whole new meaning to doing your business. Despite this unnecessary openness, all inhabitants would have also had chamber pots or commodes in their private rooms. The higher ranking you were at court, the more likely you would have been to have a small closet in your chambers in which to do your business. For those of you wondering, the first flush toilet didn't arrive at Versailles until Louis XV, the Sun King's immediate successor, had one installed for his personal use in 1738. Though inhabitants had commodes and chamber pots in their private living spaces, Versailles had public-use latrines. But considering the sheer number of people on the estate, the supply was, to say the least, woefully inadequate. The combination of minimal toilets and high demand meant the latrines were under a tremendous strain. They often overflowed, and sewage seeped through the walls and floors into neighboring rooms. Versailles had limited plumbing, which meant that chamber pots were unceremoniously dumped out the windows. Passerbys would have to move with caution. And as we covered in our video on hygiene during the French Revolution, even Marie Antoinette was said to have once been hit by flying waste. Sacre Dieu! If the pots weren't dumped out the window, they would have to be transported to one of the nearby cesspools that collected waste. Given the lack of adequate plumbing and the density of people at the palace, many courtiers answered nature's call whenever and wherever it was most convenient. Seeing someone in the act of relieving him or herself wasn't an uncommon sight. The Princesse d'Harcourt, for one, didn't think twice about urinating in public. In 1702, German-born Princess Elizabeth Charlotte recoiled at the behavior she saw at the French court. In her words, "The people stationed in the galleries in front of our rooms piss in all the corners. It is impossible to leave one's apartment without seeing someone peeing." Louis XIV finally made a point of directing servants to clean up the waste weekly. By all accounts, the stench of Versailles was horrendous and overpowering. According to one eyewitness, the unpleasant odors in the park, gardens, even the chateau, could make a person literally gag. The hallways, courtyards, and corridors were full of urine and feces, and the Avenue Saint-Cloud was covered with stagnant water and dead cats. So what did the courtiers do to counteract the stomach-churning smells that filled the air? They attempted to cover it up. Yes, most of the residents routinely doused themselves with generous quantities of perfume. As historian Alan Corbin put it, to use excessive amounts of perfume was to protect oneself and to purify the surrounding air. But it was ultimately counterproductive. The prevalence of perfumes only made things worse, since it added yet another fragrance to the already unbearable stench. Versailles was also a hotbed of liaisons amongst all classes. After Louis XIV moved his court to the former hunting lodge, workers and nobles alike descended on the town. According to people who were there at the time, the forest surrounding the palace grounds became a kind of open-air brothel, since sex workers could be solicited there. In light of what he deemed to be the immoral licentiousness of his court and kingdom, Louis vigorously policed sex workers and marked them as sinners. However, contrary to Louis's public stances on morality, he maintained numerous mistresses. A political leader saying one thing and doing the opposite? That's hard to believe. After a lifetime of dental problems, Louis XIV was toothless by the time he passed in 1715. His dental woes were bad, but they were far from unique. Decadent treats made with refined sugar began to be widely available in France in the 17th century. French aristocrats, who were apparently indifferent to the effects of poor dental care, gobbled them up, and it typically led to rotted teeth. Despite, or perhaps because of, the prevalence of rotten teeth, having a good mouth was important to many courtiers at Versailles and their beauty ideals. As described in the 17th century text, The School of Venus, a beautiful woman should have even and very white teeth. Courtiers used various powders and mouthwashes to give the appearance of healthy teeth. Thanks in part to improvements in dentistry, oral hygiene had become a mark of elegance by the middle of the 18th century. In an alleged bid to conceal his own thinning hair, Louis XIV had been credited with helping popularize those fancy wigs they used to wear in France. But the wigs did more than just conceal male-pattern baldness. They protected against lice. Well, sort of. See, the lice often infested them instead of a person's scalp, and boiling a lice-covered wig was way easier than picking lice out of a person's hair. That being said, men typically shaved their heads in order to wear wigs and control lice, while women, by and large, did not. The hygienic conditions at Versailles also impacted food. The plumbing problems, for example, made life difficult for the palace's cooks. For example, on at least one occasion, sewage seeped into Marie Antoinette's private kitchens and poisoned everything. Though hand-washing was part of Louis XIV's dining ritual, there is evidence that food was not always prepared or handled properly. As a result, intestinal parasites lived within courtiers at Versailles. Even the king wasn't spared, and it is known that he had several bouts of tapeworm. In fact, during one of those bouts, Louis is said to have relieved himself of a worm that was nearly 6 inches long. Despite how famous it is today, Versailles was never really an obvious location for a royal court. Initially built as a hunting lodge, it wasn't near flowing water, which could whisk away waste. Worse, the site was built on what one observer called shifting sand and marsh. So when Louis XIV decided to move his court there, the already poor hygienic situation at Versailles quickly deteriorated as more people descended on the space. Making matters worse exponentially was the fact that Louis generally stayed put at Versailles rather than circulating between multiple palaces, as kings had previously done. This put an impossible housekeeping burden on the army of servants and caretakers who simply couldn't keep up with the mountains of filth and waste that courtiers produced. Versailles was filthy, but a great place if you happened to be a cat person. In fact, any visitor to Versailles would have seen cats, both domestic and feral, throughout the palace estate. Some members of court brought their own pets, and the heaps of food of waste attracted rodents, which in turn attracted the cats that hunted them. Of course, the presence of so many cats led to even more sanitation problems. Feline droppings could be spotted all over the grounds. Worse, the remains of deceased cats could be found along the town's main thoroughfare. The reddish-purple-brown color known as puce got its name at Versailles, amusingly, thanks to a pest. It happened in 1775 when Marie Antoinette wore a gown in that color, prompting her husband Louis XVI to compare the color to une puce, or a flea. Despite the comparison, the color caught on. In fact, according to the Baroness d'Oberkirch, every lady at court wore a puce-colored gown. Old puce, young puce, ventre de puce, dos de puce, etc. Puce wasn't the only color to get its name at Versailles. After the birth of Louis XVI's heir in 1781, courtiers marked the occasion by wearing a new color. They called it caca dauphin, or dauphin poop, because it was as brown as the infant's excrement. And you thought comparing the color of a dress to a flea was unflattering. After Louis XIV passed in 1715, his 5-year-old great-grandson inherited the throne as Louis XV. Recognizing the unhygienic and generally stinky state of the palace, Louis XV began several renovation projects aimed at cleaning things up a little. Chief among them was seeing to it that the sewage pipes were extended. This put a greater distance between the palace and its cesspools of human waste, which, if nothing else, had to be a good place to start. So what do you think? Would you have liked living at the Court of Versailles? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.